In the town of Gravity Falls, beneath the surface of summer adventures and silly moments, there existed something deeper. Something that whispered through the pages of old journals and hummed in the frequency of forgotten machines. This is not a story of monsters defeated or villains vanquished, but rather a gentle exploration of the mysteries that lingered in the spaces between what was shown and what was hidden. The theories that fans and viewers puzzled over, the clues embedded in every frame, and the darkness that made the light shine brighter. As you settle in to listen, let yourself drift through these quiet mysteries, these soft shadows, these gentle questions that have no need for urgent answers. The summer began with a journal, red leather worn smooth by time and hands, marked with a 6-fingered palm and the number 3. When Dipper found it in the woods, buried in a metallic tree stump, he discovered something that had been waiting. The journal was not simply a catalog of creatures and anomalies. It was a warning, written by someone who had seen too much and feared what would come. Each page held careful documentation, but between the lines, in the margins, and hidden beneath invisible inks, were messages that spoke of deeper concerns. The author, Stanford Pines, had not simply been recording Gravity Falls for academic curiosity. He had been trying to understand something fundamental about the nature of reality itself, and what he found had shaken him to his core. Throughout the journal were symbols that repeated, appearing in different contexts, but always carrying weight. A wheel with 10 figures arranged around it, a triangle with a single eye, warnings in codes that required patience to decipher. When viewers looked closely at the show itself, they found these same symbols embedded in the background, hidden in the credits, whispered in reversed audio tracks. The creators had woven a tapestry of clues, each one leading to another, each one suggesting that the story being told was only the surface of something much larger. These were not accidents or coincidences. They were breadcrumbs left intentionally, inviting those who watched to look deeper, to question what they saw, to understand that in Gravity Falls, nothing was quite as simple as it seemed. The backward messages were perhaps the most unsettling discovery. At the end of certain episodes, during the credits, there would be whispers. When played in reverse, these whispers became words, sentences, warnings. They spoke of deals and demons, of watching and waiting. They mentioned names before those characters appeared. They hinted at betrayals and sacrifices yet to come. Bill Cipher's voice, even in reverse, carried a mocking tone, as if he knew that someone would take the time to listen, to decode, to understand. He was speaking directly to those who watched, breaking the fourth wall in the most subtle way, reminding viewers that he existed in a space between dimensions, and perhaps the dimension of the viewer was not so separate from Gravity Falls as one might hope. The wheel symbol appeared first in the journal, then carved into walls, and finally in the apocalyptic confrontation with Bill Cipher himself. 10 symbols, each representing a figure central to Gravity Falls. A pine tree for Dipper, a shooting star for Mabel, a question mark for Seuss, an ice bag for Wendy, glasses for Ford, a fez for Stan, a llama for Pacifica, a tent of telepathy for Gideon, a spectacles for McGucket, a stitched heart for Robbie. This wheel, this zodiac, was presented as the key to defeating Bill, a ritual that required all 10 to join hands and stand together. The theory emerged that this wheel represented not just a weapon, but a fundamental structure of Gravity Falls itself. that the town's weirdness was held in balance by these figures, that their presence and their connections created a barrier against interdimensional chaos. When the ritual failed, when Stan and Ford could not put aside their argument for even a moment, the barrier fell completely, and Weirdmageddon began in earnest. Some who watched carefully theorized that the wheel had existed long before the summer, that it represented cycles that repeated across time. Perhaps other groups of 10 had stood in those positions in previous eras, maintaining the balance, keeping Bill at bay. Perhaps the founding of Gravity Falls itself was connected to this wheel, to the need for specific types of individuals to be present in the town. The theory suggested that fate, or destiny, or something more deliberate, had drawn these particular people together at this particular time, not by accident, but because the fabric of reality required it. Dipper and Mabel's arrival was not random. Ford's return through the portal was not simply Stan's doing. Every piece had moved into position over decades, over generations, preparing for the moment when Bill would make his final attempt to break through. The codes hidden in the journals used various ciphers. Caesar ciphers, where each letter was shifted by a certain number. Atbash ciphers, where the alphabet was reversed. Visionaire ciphers, requiring a keyword to decode. Each journal used a different method, as if the author was becoming more paranoid, more concerned about who might find his work. But what was he hiding? The decoded messages spoke of trust broken, of a partner who betrayed, of a demon who came offering knowledge and brought only destruction. They spoke of a device, a portal, that should never have been built. They warned of summer, of the end of summer specifically, as a time of great danger. They mentioned a rift, a tear between worlds that once opened could never be fully sealed. The backwards messages in the show often reference these same themes. 3 letters back, they would say, or switch places, or the truth is hidden in the codes. The creators were training viewers to look deeper, to question, to decode. And those who did found layers upon layers of story. They found that Bill's appearances were foreshadowed episodes in advance through tiny triangles hidden in backgrounds. They found that certain characters' dialogue, when examined closely, contained double meanings that only made sense after later revelations. They found that the show itself was structured like a code, with answers hidden in plain sight for those patient enough to look. The theory emerged that perhaps the entire show, from the viewer's perspective, was itself a mystery left by Stanford Pines. That he had somehow documented his summer with the twins in this format, encoding warnings and truths within what appeared to be a children's cartoon, hoping that someone in another dimension might see it and understand what had happened in Gravity Falls. That the fourth wall breaks, the hidden messages, the direct addresses to the audience were not just clever storytelling, but part of the mystery itself. That we, the watchers, were being warned about Bill Cipher, about interdimensional threats, about the thinness of the barriers between realities. This theory suggested that entertainment itself could be a form of dimensional communication, that stories could leak between worlds, and that Bill Cipher's ability to exist in the mindscape meant he could potentially reach any mind that thought about him, including those watching the show. It was a theory that made the horror more personal, that suggested the danger was not safely contained in a fictional Oregon town, but could spread through the very act of watching, of thinking about, of discussing these events. Bill's statement that he was always watching took on new meaning under this interpretation. He was watching through the screen, through the story, through the repeated viewings and analyses. His defeat in Stan's mind was total within that dimension. But what about others? Of course, this theory was speculation, built on the meta-textual elements and the show's playful relationship with its audience. But it spoke to something deeper about the nature of the mysteries presented. The creators had crafted something that invited interpretation, that rewarded attention, that suggested depths beneath the surface. Whether or not Bill Cipher could literally reach through dimensions, the show had created a mythology rich enough that viewers could theorize about it endlessly, finding new connections, new meanings, new warnings in every rewatch. The symbol of the eye appeared everywhere. On Bill's pyramid form, yes, but also hidden throughout the town, painted on walls, carved into wood, appearing in the patterns of wallpaper and the arrangement of objects. The all-seeing eye, a symbol with ancient meanings in our world too. Surveillance, knowledge, enlightenment, conspiracy. In Gravity Falls, it marked Bill's influence, his presence, his watching. But the theory suggested it might mean more. That perhaps Bill had been influencing Gravity Falls for far longer than Ford's generation. That the town itself might have been built on ground where the dimensional walls were already thin, and Bill had been reaching through in small ways for centuries, leaving his mark, preparing for the day when someone would be foolish enough to build him a portal. The prophecies in the journals spoke of a triangular demon, of deals made and prices paid, of the end times and the unmaking of reality. But they also spoke of hope, of specific individuals who would stand against the chaos. The pine tree and the shooting star featured prominently. Ford had known somehow that 2 children marked with these symbols would be crucial. He had seen it, or dreamed it, or calculated it during his time researching the town's weirdness. The question was whether this was prediction or prescription. Had Ford simply foreseen that Dipper and Mabel would be important, or had his documentation of them, his creation of symbols associated with them, somehow made it so? Did the prophecy create the heroes, or did the heroes fulfill a prophecy that existed independent of observation? These questions dissolved into the comfortable mystery of unanswerable things. The show provided enough information to theorize, but not enough to conclude. It left space for interpretation, for imagination, for the viewer to decide what they believed. And in that space, in that gentle uncertainty, there was room to rest, to let the mind wander through possibilities without needing to grasp any single truth too tightly. Bill Cipher appeared first as a helpful guide, a strange creature from the mindscape who offered Gideon the tools to win Mabel's heart. But even in that first appearance, there was something wrong about him. His design, a simple yellow triangle with a single eye and top hat, should have been charming, silly even. Instead, there was menace in his floating presence, in his deals, in the way he seemed to know too much. As the series progressed, as more of Bill's nature was revealed, a theory developed about what he truly was and where he came from. Bill claimed to be from the second dimension, a flat realm that he had destroyed, liberating it from its constraints. But what did that mean? What was a second dimension in the context of a universe with many? The theory suggested that Bill was not simply from a place with 2 spatial dimensions, but from a fundamental layer of reality itself. That dimensions in the show's cosmology were not just physical arrangements of space, but layers of existence stacked upon each other like pages in a book. The first dimension would be pure potential, a line of possibility. The second dimension would be the realm of patterns, of information, of thought itself. The third dimension, where gravity falls existed, was matter and space and time. Beyond that were higher dimensions that even Ford had only glimpsed, realms where cause and effect worked differently, where consciousness took stranger forms. Bill's existence as a geometric shape, as pure pattern and information, supported this theory. He was not a creature of flesh or matter in the traditional sense. He was a living idea, a conscious equation, a pattern that had become aware of itself and rebelled against the constraints of its native dimension. His destruction of his home realm was not a physical apocalypse, but an informational one. He had introduced paradox, chaos, true randomness into a place of pure order and pattern. He had, in essence, divided by zero, creating a collapse that ejected him into higher dimensions, where he could perceive and interact with physical beings. This made Bill fundamentally different from every other creature in Gravity Falls. The gnomes, the manitors, the shapeshifter, even the time anomalies. These were all physical beings or physical phenomena. They existed in space, could be touched, could be frozen or captured or reasoned with on some level. Bill existed in minds, in dreams, in the space of thought and deals. He could only enter the physical world through possession or through a rift, a tear in the fabric that separated the mental from the material. This was why he needed Ford's portal, why he needed a physical doorway into the third dimension. Without it, he could influence, manipulate, deal, but not directly act. The theory extended further. If Bill was from the dimension of pure information and pattern, then his goal was not simply conquest or chaos for its own sake. He was trying to impose his nature onto our reality, to transform the third dimension into something like his original home, before he destroyed it. A realm where physical laws were mutable, where thoughts became immediate reality, where pattern and chaos danced without the constraints of matter. Weirdmageddon was not random destruction. It was transformation. The strange bubbles, the floating objects, the fluid reality. These were the third dimension being converted into the second. Matter being reduced to pure pattern and information. Physical beings becoming vulnerable to mental manipulation. This explained why Bill's ultimate plan involved spreading Weirdmageddon beyond Gravity Falls. It was not enough to transform one town. He wanted to cascade the effect, to use Gravity Falls as a starting point for transforming all of reality into a place where he could exist comfortably, where beings like him could thrive. The natural laws that constrained him would dissolve. Physics would become optional. And Bill, as a conscious pattern with eons of experience manipulating information, would effectively become a god in such a realm. Ford's understanding of this, incomplete as it was, drove his desperation to stop the portal. He had glimpsed what Bill truly wanted, had seen the other dimensions where Bill's influence had already spread, had understood that allowing even a small permanent rift would be catastrophic. This was why he was willing to stay trapped in the dimensional space between worlds for 30 years, rather than let the portal remain open. This was why he immediately tried to shut it down upon returning, even though his brother had sacrificed everything to bring him back. The stakes were not just personal, or even planetary. They were existential in the most fundamental sense. The nature of Bill's deals took on darker implications under this theory. When Bill made a deal with someone, he was not simply trading services. He was creating a binding connection, a link between his pattern and theirs. Each deal gave him a small anchor point in the third dimension, a tiny piece of influence, a fraction of presence. Enough deals, enough connections, and he could begin to affect physical reality, even without a portal. This was why he pursued deals so persistently, why he seemed to enjoy the contract and the handshake and the specific wording. He was building a network of influence, preparing the ground for his eventual emergence. Gideon's deals gave Bill access to a physical child with ambition and resources. The power amulet Bill directed Gideon toward was a tool, but the real goal was having an agent in the physical world. Dipper's brief deal, possession of his body, gave Bill his first true taste of physical existence and revealed how vulnerable humans were when he inhabited them. Ford's original deal, the one that started everything, gave Bill access to one of the most brilliant minds on Earth and, through Ford's work, a blueprint for building the portal that would set him free. Each deal was carefully chosen, carefully worded, carefully executed. Bill appeared as a muse, as help, as the answer to problems. He waited until his targets were desperate or ambitious or exhausted enough to overlook the warning signs. And once the deal was struck, once the handshake burned with blue flame, the person was marked. They carried a piece of Bill's pattern within them, a connection that he could activate, a hook that he could pull. The ultimate deal was the one Bill tried to make with Ford in the mindscape during Weirdmageddon. He wanted the equation, the information that would let him break free of the barrier, keeping him confined to Gravity Falls. But Ford refused, even under torture, even with his brother's body being puppeted before him. This refusal was crucial. Ford had made the mistake of dealing with Bill once before. He would not do so again, no matter the cost. His resistance forced Bill to try to trick Stan, to enter what he thought was Ford's mind, and that mistake became his undoing. Stan's mindscape, the place where Bill was finally erased, was itself a fascinating element. The theory suggested that mindscapes in Gravity Falls were not metaphorical, but literal spaces. Each conscious being generated a mental dimension, a pocket universe where their thoughts, memories, and sense of self existed as a tangible place. Bill could navigate these spaces, could move between them, could alter and manipulate them. But he was also vulnerable there. In the physical world, Bill was untouchable, a pattern that could not be grasped. But in the mindscape, he was present, substantial, able to be fought or trapped, or, as ultimately happened, erased. Stan's sacrifice was to allow his entire mindscape to be wiped clean. The memory gun, a device McGucket had invented and then used on himself countless times, could erase specific memories or, at full power, erase everything. By allowing Ford to use it on him while Bill was inside his mind, Stan was effectively destroying the universe that Bill was inhabiting. It was not just a matter of forgetting, it was ontological deletion. Stan's memories, his sense of self, his entire mental dimension was unmade, and Bill, trapped inside it, was unmade along with it. The fact that Stan's memories could be restored, slowly and partially, suggested that memory in Gravity Falls worked on multiple levels. The surface memories, the easily accessible ones, were stored in the mindscape and could be erased. But deeper patterns, muscle memory, emotional connections, the fundamental personality, these existed at a level the memory gun could not reach. Stan's recovery was not remembering in the traditional sense, but rebuilding, allowing the deep patterns of his self to reconstruct the surface memories through the stories and evidence presented to him. But Bill's erasure was complete. He existed only in the mindscape, only as pattern and information. When Stan's mindscape was wiped, there was no deeper level for Bill to retreat to, no physical brain or body to anchor him. He was simply gone, his pattern scattered into randomness, his consciousness dissolved, or so it seemed. The final backward message, the one Bill spoke as he was being erased, hinted at something else. He invoked the name of the axolotl, a being Ford had mentioned, something vast and powerful that existed in the spaces between dimensions. Some theorized that Bill had a backup plan, that the axolotl reference was a last-minute deal or escape clause, that perhaps Bill's pattern was not truly destroyed but stored, waiting, somewhere in the infinite dimensional space. This theory was darker than a simple happy ending would allow. It suggested that Bill Cipher, a being of pure information and pattern, might be impossible to truly kill. That as long as anyone remembered him, thought about him, told his story, his pattern existed somewhere. And patterns, in the cosmology of Gravity Falls, had a way of manifesting. The show's final image, a statue of Bill in the woods, hinted at this. Was it a memorial to a defeated foe? Or was it a warning? Or perhaps something worse? A monument that served as an anchor point, a place where Bill's pattern could, given enough time and enough people thinking about him near it, begin to reform? The creators left it ambiguous, left it as a gentle unease rather than a sharp horror. The story had ended. Bill was defeated. The twins went home. But the mysteries remained, the theories persisted, and the idea that a being like Bill could never be entirely gone from the multiverse once he had existed within it was a thought that settled into the comfortable space of uncertainty where good rest could still be found. The portal was a wound in reality, a machine that should never have been built, a doorway that opened onto infinite darkness and infinite possibility. When Dipper and Mabel first discovered it, hidden beneath the mystery shack, it was dormant, a massive triangular structure with Stan desperately trying to make it work. Stan had spent 3 decades studying Ford's journals, teaching himself physics and engineering far beyond his education, stealing and scamming to fund his work, all to bring his brother back. The portal represented Stan's love and his guilt, his refusal to accept that Ford was gone, his determination to fix what he had broken so many years ago. But what was the portal, really? Ford had designed it based on his understanding of dimensional theory, augmented by information provided by Bill Cipher. It was meant to be a window, a way to observe and document other dimensions safely. But Bill's influence had corrupted the design. Instead of a window, Ford had built a door. Instead of observation, it allowed travel. And instead of being safely controlled, it had pulled Ford through and trapped him in the dimensional space between realities, a realm of chaos and danger that few could survive. The dimensional space between worlds was described by Ford in fragments, in journal entries and brief comments. It was a place without consistent physics, where time flowed strangely when it flowed at all, where creatures from 1,000 different realities drifted or hunted or simply existed in ways that made no sense to three-dimensional minds. Ford had survived through cleverness, through allies he made, through his 6 fingers, which apparently marked him as special or significant in some dimensions. He had learned to navigate the chaos, to find pockets of stability, to avoid the attention of things vast and hungry that moved through the space between spaces. But more than survival, Ford had learned. He had seen other dimensions where Bill had influenced events, where deals had been made, where chaos had spread. He had understood that Bill was not unique, that the mindscape connected all dimensions, and that beings like Bill, beings of pure pattern and information, could exist in that mindscape and reach into any dimension where conscious beings created mental space. He had seen civilizations that had fallen to such beings, realities that had been transformed or destroyed, and he had understood that Earth, that Gravity Falls specifically, was next on that list. The theory developed that Gravity Falls' weirdness was not a coincidence. The town sat on a weak point, a place where the dimensional walls were naturally thin. Perhaps it was geological, some unique arrangement of crystals or magnetic fields. Perhaps it was historical, the result of ancient events or beings that had affected the area. Perhaps it was both, a feedback loop where natural weakness attracted supernatural attention, which further weakened the barriers, which attracted more attention. Whatever the cause, Gravity Falls was a place where the impossible happened regularly, where creatures from other realms could slip through, where the mindscape pressed close against physical reality. Ford had chosen Gravity Falls for his research because of this weirdness, but Bill had chosen Ford because Ford was in Gravity Falls. It was a trap built across years, across dimensions. Bill had been watching the town, waiting for someone with the intelligence and ambition to build what he needed. Ford had been perfect, brilliant, isolated, hungry for knowledge, willing to trust a strange muse who appeared in his dreams. Bill had guided Ford's research, had provided equations and insights, had slowly steered him toward building the portal. And Ford, blinded by the excitement of discovery, had not realized until too late what he was creating. The moment Ford understood Bill's true nature and true intentions was the moment he called Stanley, reaching out to the brother he had not spoken to in years, begging him to come to Gravity Falls and hide the journals so they could never be brought together again. The 3 journals, Ford explained, contained the complete plans for the portal. Scattered and hidden, they were useless. Together, they were a blueprint for apocalypse. Stanley came, they argued. Ford was pulled through the portal, and the long nightmare began. Stanley's decision to rebuild the portal was not made lightly. He had his brother's warnings. He had seen the danger. But he also had his guilt, his love, and his fundamental belief that he could fix things. Stan was not educated. He was not a scientist. But he was determined and clever and unwilling to give up. He taught himself, experimented, failed, tried again. He built a life as a cover, the mystery shack and its tourist trap facade, funding his real work through cons and ticket sales. He pushed away anyone who got too close, unable to tell them the truth, unable to risk them interfering with his work. 30 years of isolation, 30 years of risk. And finally, the portal worked. Ford returned. And Ford's immediate reaction was to try to shut it down, to dismantle it, to prevent anyone from ever using it again. The rift that remained, the tear in dimensional space that Stan's activation had created, was a ticking time bomb. It was stable in its containment field, but any disruption, any breaking of the field, and it would tear open completely, allowing Bill and anything else in the dimensional space to pour through into Gravity Falls. The brothers fought over this. Stan had sacrificed everything to bring Ford back, and Ford's first action was to try to destroy the portal and dismiss Stan's efforts. The wound between them, the one that had started with a broken science project and a ruined future, reopened. They could not bridge it, could not communicate past the pain and anger and decades of resentment. And that failure, that inability to reconcile, became the weakness that allowed Bill to exploit them later. The rift itself was a fascinating object. Contained in a small dimensional field projector, it looked like a shimmering orb of impossible colors, angles that hurt to look at, a piece of the space between dimensions made portable. Ford kept it with him always, knowing it was the most dangerous object in Gravity Falls, knowing that Bill wanted it more than anything. As long as the rift remained contained, Bill was limited to the mindscape, to deals and manipulation. But if the rift broke open, if it was shattered, Bill could manifest physically, could begin Weirdmageddon, could start the process of transforming Earth into a realm where he could exist freely. The theory emerged that the rift was not just a tear, but a connection, a thin spot that linked Gravity Falls to all the other dimensions simultaneously. Breaking it would not just open one door, but countless doors, would turn Gravity Falls into a dimensional nexus where anything from anywhere could emerge. This explained the bizarre nature of Weirdmageddon, the mixed creatures, the impossible physics, the sense that multiple realities were overlapping. It was not just Bill's dimension bleeding through, but fragments of countless dimensions, all pressing in through the rift, all transforming the town into a place where the normal rules no longer applied. Bill's manipulation to shatter the rift was elaborate and patient. He could not take it from Ford directly. Ford was too careful, too paranoid, too aware of the danger. So Bill focused on Mabel, young and trusting and vulnerable. He manipulated events, whispered suggestions through his various agents, created situations that would stress her. And when the perfect moment came, when Mabel was heartbroken and desperate, Bill appeared as Blendan Blandon, a time traveler she had met before, someone she trusted. He offered her a way to keep summer from ending, to pause time, to never have to face the changes that terrified her. And the price was a small favor, a little rift in a container that Ford was keeping from her. Just give it to Blendan. Just let him take this thing Ford was hoarding. Just trust. And Mabel, tired and sad and scared, did. She handed over the rift. Blendan revealed himself as Bill. The rift shattered, and Weirdmageddon began in a cascade of nightmares made real, of the sky cracking, of gravity failing, of the town transforming into the chaos Bill had promised. The theory suggested that Bill had been planning this specific manipulation from the moment the twins arrived in Gravity Falls. That everything, every encounter, every crisis, had been steering toward that moment when Mabel would be vulnerable enough to make a mistake. It cast all the summer's adventures in a darker light. Not random occurrences, but pieces of a plan. Moves in a game Bill was playing with humans who did not even know they were pieces on a board. The portal's ultimate fate was ambiguous. After Bill's defeat, after reality was restored, the portal presumably remained beneath the shack, dormant but intact. Ford and Stan, finally reconciled, left to explore the dimensional seas together, their ship disappearing into adventure. But they left behind a town that had been touched by the multiverse, people who had seen impossible things, and a machine that could, in theory, be activated again. The knowledge of its construction was scattered across 3 journals, which Dipper and Mabel took with them when they left. But knowledge, once created, cannot be uncreated. The theory suggested that the portal was a seed, that understanding of dimensional travel was now loose in the world, and that eventually someone else would build another door, another rift, and Bill or beings like him would have another opportunity. This was the darker implication of the show's mythology, that the battle against interdimensional chaos was not a single fight, but an eternal struggle. That every generation would face some version of this threat. That the thin places in reality, the gravity falls of the world, would always attract attention from things that should not be able to reach through. And that the best anyone could do was stand against it when their time came, protect the rift while it existed, and hope that the barriers held long enough for life to continue in blessed ignorance of what lurked in the spaces between dimensions. But these were thoughts for waking minds, for analysis and discussion. For sleep, for rest, it was enough to know that the portal existed, that it was a doorway to infinite strangeness, and that it had been opened and closed, and the world continued. The specific mechanics, the specific dangers, these could fade into the comfortable blur of mystery where details mattered less than the sense of wonder and the assurance that, in the story, the heroes had succeeded. For now, for that summer. And that was enough. The story of Stanley and Stanford Pines began long before the events in Gravity Falls, decades in the past, in a childhood home on the beach where 2 brothers were inseparable. They were twins, but not identical, each reflecting different aspects of their parents' hopes and fears. Stanford was brilliant, academic, strange in his way with his 6 fingers on each hand, marking him as different. Stanley was clever in other ways, street smart, protective, always looking for the angle. They balanced each other. Together, they were going to be adventurers, explorers, sailing the world on their own boat, the Stan-O War, seeing everything, discovering everything, never being apart. But something happened. A science project, a broken, perpetual motion machine, an accident or sabotage, or a moment of anger. The show left it slightly ambiguous, but the result was clear. Stanford's project was destroyed the night before the competition. His chance at a prestigious scholarship evaporated, and he blamed Stanley. Their father, a harsh man who had little patience for failure, threw Stanley out. At 17, Stanley was on the streets with nothing. While Stanford went to a local college, his dreams diminished but not destroyed. The brothers did not speak. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too complete. But was it betrayal? The theory emerged that perhaps the machine's destruction was not entirely Stanley's fault. That perhaps there were elements of the story not fully revealed, complications in the family dynamic, pressures and misunderstandings that a child could not fully process or explain. Stanley himself seemed uncertain about what exactly had happened, his memories of that night colored by guilt and his father's immediate condemnation. He carried the blame because it was given to him, because it fit the narrative of Stanley as the screw-up, the disappointment, the twin who could not measure up. Stanley's years on the streets were touched on briefly, but suggested a darkness. He drifted, conned, stole, survived. He was arrested multiple times, spent time in prisons in multiple countries, was wanted by various authorities under various names. He built a life out of false identities and quick exits, never staying anywhere long, never forming connections, always moving. There was a loneliness in this that Stanley never fully expressed, a hollowness that came from being cut off from the only person who had ever truly understood him. He had lost his brother, his family, his future, all in one night. And he spent decades trying to outrun that loss through constant motion and reinvention. Stanford, meanwhile, became the academic his family had hoped for. He studied at local college, then earned scholarships to better institutions, eventually attracting the attention of a government grant that funded his research into anomalies and fringe science. He came to Gravity Falls following reports of high strangeness, and he found a paradise for someone with his interests. The town was full of impossible things, creatures and phenomena that defied conventional science. Stanford documented everything, compiled his findings into journals, and dove deeper and deeper into the mysteries. But isolation did something to Stanford. Living alone in the forest, spending all his time with anomalies and creatures, having no one to talk to except his own notes, he became strange himself. Paranoid, obsessive. When Bill Cipher appeared to him in dreams, offering knowledge and friendship, Stanford accepted eagerly. He was so alone, so desperate for someone who understood his work, that he overlooked the warning signs. Bill became his muse, his collaborator, his friend. And Bill slowly, carefully guided Stanford toward building the portal. The partnership between Bill and Ford was presented as a corruption, but the theory suggested it was also tragic. Ford genuinely believed he was doing good work, advancing human knowledge, documenting the multiverse. Bill's suggestions seemed helpful, insightful, brilliant. It was only when the portal was nearly complete, when Ford began to test it and saw what it actually did, that he understood he had been manipulated. The portal was not a window, but a doorway, not for observation, but for invasion. Bill had been using him, playing him, setting up the exact circumstances needed to give Bill physical access to Earth. Ford's realization led to a breakdown. His journal entries from this period were frantic, paranoid, filled with warnings and desperate contingency plans. He tried to dismantle the portal, but found that Bill could possess him, control his body, continue the work while Ford slept. He began staying awake for days, drinking coffee until his hands shook, writing warnings to himself in case Bill took control. He created the bunker and filled it with fail-safes. He reached out to McGucket, who had been helping with the portal's construction, and together they tried to find a way to stop what they had started. McGucket's response was to invent the memory gun. If he could not stop the portal, if he could not unsee what he had seen in the dimensional space during test runs, he could at least forget. He erased his own memories of the portal, of Ford, of everything. And when that did not bring peace, when the gaps in his memory created their own anxiety, he erased more and more, until he was the town's crazy old man, living in the dump, his brilliant mind reduced to fragments and paranoia. Ford, now truly alone, made the decision to hide the journals and call Stanley. It was a last resort, reaching out to the brother he had not spoken to in years, the brother he blamed for his derailed future. But Stanley came, The theory suggested that Stanley never hesitated, that despite everything, despite the decade of silence, when Ford called, Stanley came immediately, perhaps hoping for reconciliation, perhaps just unable to refuse when his brother needed him, perhaps still holding on to the dream of the Stano War and shared adventures. But the meeting went wrong. Ford was paranoid, sleep-deprived, barely coherent. Stanley was defensive, hurt, unable to understand why he had been summoned after so long. They argued. Ford demanded Stanley take one journal and hide it, never bring it back, never let anyone find all three. Stanley wanted answers, wanted acknowledgement, wanted his brother to actually talk to him instead of giving orders. The argument became physical. They struggled near the portal. Stanley hit the activation button accidentally. The portal roared to life. Ford was pulled through. And Stanley, watching his brother disappear into impossible light, was left alone with the wreckage of their relationship and a machine he did not understand. The theory suggested that this moment, this accident, was actually foreseen by Bill. That the entire sequence of events, from the broken science project to the fight by the portal, had been nudged and manipulated across decades. Bill needed Ford gone, but needed the portal to remain, needed someone desperate enough to try to reactivate it without fully understanding the risks. Stanley was perfect for this role. Too uneducated to realize what he was doing, too guilty to walk away, too stubborn to give up. Bill had created the circumstances that would turn Stanley into the tool that would eventually complete Bill's plan. But Bill had not accounted for Stanley's love. 30 years of work, of sacrifice, of isolation, all to bring Ford back. And when Ford returned, Stanley had changed. He was no longer the screw-up brother, no longer the disappointing twin. He had built something, maintained something, accomplished something impossible through sheer determination. And Ford had to recognize that, had to see that Stanley had grown, had become someone worthy of respect. Their reconciliation was not immediate. Old wounds do not heal quickly, but they work toward it. And in the end, when the choice came between defeating Bill and preserving their individual selves, they chose together. Stanley's willingness to have his memories erased to trap Bill. Ford's willingness to destroy his brother's mind to save the world. It was a sacrifice born from 30 years of separation and guilt and love that neither had been able to express until the moment of ultimate crisis. The restoration of Stanley's memories after Bill's defeat was presented as a happy ending, but the theory suggested it was more complex than simple recovery. The Stanley who came back was not quite the same Stanley who had been erased. He had gaps, moments he could not recall, pieces of himself that had not fully reconnected. But he also had something he had never had before. Ford's acknowledgement, Ford's gratitude, Ford's love explicitly expressed. The brothers who sailed away together on the Stano War were not the same brothers who had been separated decades ago. They were older, scarred, changed, but they were together. And that, perhaps, was enough. The darkness in their story was not the supernatural elements, but the human ones. The family that could not communicate. The father who threw out his son. The brothers who let pride and hurt prevent reconciliation for 30 years. The loneliness of Stanley on the streets and Stanford in his cabin, each isolated in their own way, each suffering from a separation that could have been bridged with a single conversation, neither was willing to have. The real tragedy was not the portal or Bill or the memory erasure, but the decades of lost time. The decades they could have had together if they had been able to forgive, to talk, to simply reach out. But again, for rest, for sleep, these painful human details could soften. The story ended with reconciliation, with adventure, with two old men finally getting to sail the world together. The past mattered, informed the present, but did not have to define it. Mistakes could be overcome. Relationships could be repaired. And even after 30 years of silence, brothers could find their way back to each other. That was the hope beneath the darkness, the light that made the shadows visible. The memory gun was a simple device, almost elegant in its design. A modified flashlight attached to a salvaged circuit board, powered by crystals found in the caves beneath Gravity Falls. Pointed at someone's head, pull the trigger, and specific memories would vanish, erased from the person's mind as if they had never existed. McGucket had invented it in desperation, a way to unsee the horrors he had witnessed during the Portal project. But like many inventions born from pain, the memory gun became something more than its creator intended. It became a tool of control, of escape, of slow self-destruction. McGucket's story was perhaps the saddest in Gravity Falls. He had been brilliant once, a young man with a gift for engineering and invention, recruited by Ford to help build what Ford claimed would be a window into other dimensions. McGucket had been excited, honored to work with someone of Ford's intellect, eager to push the boundaries of science. But the tests of the portal revealed things that should not be seen, creatures and spaces that existed in the dimensional void, and McGucket's mind could not process what he witnessed. He began having nightmares, panic attacks, moments where he could not distinguish what was real from what was memory. The memory gun was his solution. If he could not live with the memories, he would simply delete them. The first erasure was targeted, specific, removing only the knowledge of what he had seen through the portal. But the gaps in his memory created anxiety, questions he could not answer about where he had been and what he had done. So he erased more, removing the context around the portal, his work with Ford, entire weeks or months. Each erasure seemed to help in the moment, seemed to bring peace, but the long-term effect was cumulative. His mind became Swiss cheese, full of holes, unable to form coherent narratives about his own life. Eventually, McGucket left Ford, left his family, left everything. He founded the Society of the Blind Eye, a group dedicated to helping other people forget the weird things they witnessed in Gravity Falls. The society operated in secret, wearing robes and conducting ceremonies where they would erase the memories of anyone who had seen too much. It was presented as helping people, protecting them from traumatic knowledge. But it was also control, a way to manage what people in Gravity Falls knew and remembered, to keep the town's weirdness from becoming too widely known or believed. The theory emerged that the Society of the Blind Eye had been operating for decades, possibly even generations. That McGucket had not founded it, but had merely joined an existing organization that had been erasing memories in Gravity Falls for years. This theory was supported by the Society's established headquarters, their archives full of bottled memories going back decades, their formal structure and rituals that suggested institutional history. If true, this meant that Gravity Falls weirdness was an open secret, known to many but remembered by few, with the Society constantly working to maintain a fog of selective amnesia over the town. The darker implication was that perhaps some people wanted their memories erased, that the burden of knowing about the supernatural, about the dangers lurking in the forest and the entities that could reach through dimensional barriers, was too much for normal people to carry. The society offered them peace through ignorance, and they accepted gratefully. It raised questions about memory, identity, and the cost of knowing. Is it better to live with painful knowledge, or to erase it and live in comfortable ignorance? Is identity defined by continuous memory, or can someone remain themselves with gaps and holes in their past? McGucket's eventual recovery of his memories, thanks to Dipper and Mabel, was portrayed as positive. But the theory suggested it was also traumatic. All the things he had erased, all the horrors and failures and losses, came flooding back at once. His years of homelessness, his abandonment of his family, his role in building the portal that nearly destroyed the world, all of it returned. He had to face the person he had been and the person he had become, had to reconcile decades of fragmented existence into a coherent self. That he managed it, that he ultimately helped defeat Bill and reconnected with his son, spoke to his fundamental resilience. But the scars remained. The memory gun's final and most significant use was Stanley's sacrifice. When Bill was trapped in what he thought was Ford's mind but was actually Stanley's, Ford used the memory gun at full power to erase everything. It was not a targeted deletion, but a complete wipe, a hard reset of Stanley's entire mindscape. Every memory, every experience, every piece of knowledge and personality erased in an instant. Stanley ceased to exist as a conscious being, became a blank slate, an empty vessel where a person had been. The theory suggested that this was not just forgetting, but a form of death. That the Stanley who existed before the memory gun was fired and the Stanley who existed after were technically different people. The original Stanley died, his pattern erased, his consciousness ended. What returned was a new Stanley, rebuilt from deep personality structures and external stories, similar to the original, but not identical. This was darker than simple memory loss. It suggested that the memory gun could kill without killing the body, could end a person while leaving their flesh alive. But the show suggested otherwise. As Mabel and Dipper and Ford and the others told Stanley stories about himself, showed him photographs, triggered emotional responses, something returned. Not just new memories being written onto a blank slate, but the original Stanley reconstituting himself from fragments that the memory gun could not reach. The deep self, the fundamental personality, the patterns of behavior and emotion and relationship that existed below conscious memory, these had survived. Stanley remembered through feeling, through instinct, through the connections he had with others. This suggested a more hopeful theory about memory and identity. That we are not just our memories, not just the stories we tell ourselves about our past. We are also patterns of relationship, emotional connections, deep structures of personality that exist independent of our ability to consciously recall events. The memory gun could erase the surface, but not the depths. Stanley returned because the people who loved him called him back, because the relationships he had built over 30 years had left marks deeper than memory, had created structures of self that persisted through the erasure. The memory gun's ultimate fate was not revealed. Presumably it was destroyed, or locked away, or kept by Ford as a reminder and a warning. But the knowledge of how to build it remained. McGucket had created it from relatively simple components and principles. Anyone with his level of intelligence and access to Gravity Falls' unique crystalline structures could potentially recreate it. The theory suggested that the memory gun would inevitably be reinvented, that the ability to erase memory was too useful, too tempting, for humans to leave unexplored. This led to darker speculation about what such technology would mean if it spread beyond Gravity Falls. Governments would want it for interrogations, for classified work, for controlling populations. Individuals would want it for trauma, for guilt, for escaping painful pasts. The ability to selectively edit memory would fundamentally change human society, would make truth flexible and history mutable. What would it mean to live in a world where anyone could erase any memory at any time? How would law work? How would relationships function? How would anyone trust anything, including their own past? These were questions the show did not explore, but left implied. The memory gun was a plot device, but it was also a thought experiment about the nature of self and memory. And like many elements in Gravity Falls, it was left unresolved, a mystery that suggested depths without requiring a definitive answer. For sleep, for rest, it was enough to know that memory could be lost and found, that self could be erased and rebuilt, and that love and relationship could reach through even total forgetting to call someone back to themselves. Weirdmageddon was predicted in the journals, foretold in prophecies, whispered about in the dreams of those sensitive to dimensional thinness. It was the end times, the unmaking of reality, the moment when Bill Cipher would break through completely and transform Earth into a realm of chaos and nightmare. The signs were documented. Reality glitches increasing in frequency. Time anomalies spreading. The rift becoming unstable. Strange symbols appearing in the sky. And always, Bill's presence felt more strongly, his influence reaching further, his deals becoming more urgent and desperate as the moment approached. The prophecy was written in scattered fragments across all three journals, requiring someone to bring them together to see the full picture. It spoke of a weirdness wave that would emanate from Gravity Falls, spreading across the Earth, transforming everything in its path. Reality would become fluid. Physical laws would become optional. Madness and impossibility would reign. And Bill Cipher, freed from the constraints that kept him contained, would reshape the world in his image, a place where matter and mind blended, where thoughts became real, where the nightmares of every conscious being could manifest and feed. The prophecy also spoke of the zodiac, the wheel of 10 symbols, the ritual that could stop Bill. But it required perfect unity, all 10 individuals standing together, setting aside differences, creating a barrier of combined will against chaos. This was the test that the prophecy presented. Not a test of strength or magic or knowledge, but a test of relationship, of forgiveness, of the ability to work together despite pain and history. The failure of the ritual was the dark heart of the story. With Bill trapped and weakened, with all 10 gathered, with the wheel drawn and ready, they failed not because they were overpowered, but because Stan and Ford could not stop arguing for even a moment. Old hurts, old resentments, 30 years of separation and pain bubbled up at the worst possible time. They broke the circle. They refused to hold hands. And their failure doomed the ritual, broke the barrier, and allowed Bill to break free, and begin Weirdmageddon in earnest. The theory suggested that Bill had engineered this failure, that he had been manipulating Stan and Ford's relationship all along, ensuring that the wound between them would be too deep to heal in the moment of crisis. Bill had destroyed Ford's project decades ago, or arranged for it to be destroyed, setting in motion the separation that defined the brothers' lives. He had whispered doubts and resentments, had highlighted every difference, every failure, every moment of pain. And when the ritual began, when unity was required, he had simply reminded them of their history, and they had done the rest themselves. This was the true horror of Bill's plan. He did not need to overpower his enemies. He needed only to keep them divided. As long as humans could not set aside their differences, could not forgive, could not work together, they would be vulnerable. The zodiac was powerful, potentially powerful enough to banish Bill permanently, but it required something humans struggled with: perfect cooperation. And Bill knew this. He knew that manipulating relationships, creating division, fostering resentment, these were easier than fighting directly. So he built his plan around human weakness, and humans proved him right. Weirdmageddon itself was a cascade of nightmares. The sky shattered into pieces like broken glass. Gravity became optional. Buildings twisted into impossible shapes. The people of Gravity Falls were transformed into furniture, into decorations, into toys for Bill's amusement. His throne was the pyramid, a massive floating pyramid surrounded by his friends, interdimensional monsters and demons who had been waiting for this moment, who poured through the rift into a world suddenly vulnerable to their presence. Bill's friends were a glimpse into the multiverse's dark corners. 8-Ball, a giant floating ball with too many eyes. Cryptos, a geometric entity like Bill but different. Teeth, a creature that was exactly what its name suggested. Pyronica, living flame with awareness and malice. These and dozens of others, all beings that existed in the spaces between dimensions, all drawn to Gravity Falls by the rift, all eager to play in a reality that had lost its rules. The theory emerged that these beings were fragments of Bill, aspects of his nature given independent existence, or perhaps they were contemporaries. Other patterns that had achieved consciousness in the dimensional void. They formed a court of chaos around Bill, celebrating the unmaking of reality, participating gleefully in the transformation and torture of humans. They represented different aspects of nightmare: the eye-watching, the pattern trapping, the teeth consuming, the fire destroying. Together, they made Weirdmageddon complete, a symphony of horror conducted by Bill from his throne. But even in Weirdmageddon, there was resistance. Pockets of Gravity Falls remained untouched, protected by barriers and symbols. The Mystery Shack, specifically, was shielded by supernatural moose, weird hair-covered beings that appeared when the shack was threatened and created a barrier Bill could not pass. This protection was never fully explained, but the theory suggested it was connected to the shack's history, to its location on thin dimensional ground, to the years of Stan's work with the portal creating a permanent ward, or perhaps to something even older, some protection built into the land itself long before the Pines family arrived. Within the shack, survivors gathered, Dipper and Wendy and Suze having escaped the initial transformation. McGucket, who had prepared for this moment in his own paranoid way. Pacifica, who had been humbled by her encounters with the supernatural. Eventually, Mabel, freed from her bubble prison, And finally, Stan and Ford, forced to work together despite their resentments because the alternative was the end of everything. The plan to defeat Bill was desperate and required sacrifice. They could not overpower him. They could not outthink him, but they could trick him. Bill wanted the equation, the knowledge locked in Ford's mind that would let him break free of the barrier keeping Weirdmageddon confined to Gravity Falls. He could not take it by force from Ford's mind. Ford's mental defenses were too strong. But he could trick Ford into giving it up, or he could enter Ford's mind when Ford was vulnerable. The switch between Stan and Ford was the key. They were twins. Their minds, their patterns, were similar enough that Bill, entering what he thought was Ford's mindscape, did not immediately realize his mistake. By the time he understood, by the time he saw that he was in Stan's mind instead of Ford's, Ford had triggered the memory gun. The erasure happened instantly. Stan's entire mindscape, with Bill trapped inside it, vanished into white light. And Bill, screaming, disbelieving, invoked the axolotl as he died. The axolotl reference was mysterious and never fully explained. Ford had mentioned the axolotl in his journals, a being he had encountered in the dimensional void, something vast and ancient and powerful. Bill's invocation of its name in his final moment suggested a deal, a escape clause, a possibility of return. The theory was that Bill had made arrangements, that his destruction in Stan's mind was not his final end, but a temporary banishment. The axolotl, some theorized, was a being of reincarnation and second chances, and Bill's deal might have been to return in a different form, stripped of memories and power, to be born again and perhaps earn redemption, or perhaps simply survive to plot anew. This theory was supported by the final message, a cryptic statement about Bill returning. It was left ambiguous whether this was threat or hope, whether Bill's return would be malicious, or whether he might have a chance to change, to become something other than a demon of chaos. The show did not answer, left it as one more mystery, one more open question for viewers to debate and theorize about. Weirdmageddon's end came suddenly. With Bill destroyed, reality began to repair itself. The sky reformed. Gravity returned. People who had been transformed were restored. The town looked battered but intact, and those who had survived carried memories of nightmares made real, but also memories of survival, of fighting back, of refusing to surrender, even when everything seemed lost. The theory suggested that Weirdmageddon left permanent marks, though, that the people who experienced it would never be quite the same, that Gravity Falls itself was changed, scarred, that the dimensional walls were thinner now, more fragile, more likely to tear again, that Bill's defeat was complete within his particular expression and attempt. But the threat he represented, the weakness in reality that he had exploited, that remained. Other beings would come. Other rifts would form. The battle against chaos was not won, but merely survived for another day. But in the gentle space of sleep and rest, these darker possibilities could fade. Weirdmageddon happened and ended. Bill was defeated. The town survived. And that was enough for the story being told. Enough for the comfort of knowing that even the worst nightmares can end. Even the darkest moments can pass. And morning can come again to a world still standing. The bunker beneath the forest was Ford's secret laboratory, the place where he conducted his most dangerous experiments, and stored his most significant discoveries. It was a hidden facility, camouflaged and protected, accessible only to those who knew where to look and how to bypass the security measures Ford had installed. When Dipper and his friends found it, they discovered rooms full of strange equipment, documentation of experiments that pushed ethical boundaries, and entities that Ford had captured and studied. The shapeshifter was the most disturbing discovery, a creature that could perfectly mimic any form, that could read thoughts and memories to create flawless disguises, that had been trapped in the bunker for decades after Ford realized how dangerous it was. The shapeshifter's presence raised questions about Ford's research methods. He had captured this creature, imprisoned it, experimented on it. The shapeshifter was angry, understandably so, and when Dipper and his friends accidentally released it, it became a threat not out of inherent evil, but out of justified rage at its imprisonment. The theory emerged that Ford's research in Gravity Falls had often crossed ethical lines, that his obsession with documenting and understanding the anomalies had led him to treat creatures as specimens rather than beings. The bunker contained evidence of dissections, of forced containment, of experiments that caused pain and fear. Ford was not a villain in the traditional sense, but his single-minded pursuit of knowledge had made him callous to the suffering of others. This was reflected in his relationship with McGucket as well. Ford had pushed McGucket to help with experiments that were clearly affecting McGucket's mental health. When McGucket began showing signs of breakdown, Ford did not stop or slow down. He needed McGucket's engineering skills, and his need outweighed his concern for his friend's well-being. Only after McGucket left and began erasing his memories did Ford seem to realize what he had done, and by then, it was too late. The bunker also contained Ford's documentation of Bill, the progression of their relationship from collaboration to paranoia to horror. Journal entries showed how Bill had slowly revealed his true nature, how Ford had realized too late that he was being manipulated, how his attempts to shut down the portal had been thwarted by Bill possessing him. The bunker was where Ford had attempted to build weapons against Bill, devices that could disrupt dream manipulation, symbols that could ward against possession. But the bunker's greatest secret was what Ford had seen during the early portal tests. Before the portal pulled him through, Ford had conducted experiments, brief activations that opened windows into other dimensions. He had sent probes through, had observed what existed on the other side, and what he saw had terrified him. Not just Bill waiting, but entire dimensions that had been conquered, transformed, destroyed. Civilizations that had fallen to beings like Bill. Realities that had become playgrounds for chaos. The theory suggested that Ford understood, perhaps better than anyone, the existential threat that Bill represented. That his paranoia and his desperate attempts to hide the journals were not overreaction, but appropriate response to what he knew was coming. Ford had seen the future that Bill wanted, had glimpsed what Earth would become if Bill succeeded, and he could not accept it. This drove him to extreme measures, to destroying his work, to calling Stanley, to allowing himself to be pulled through the portal if it meant the portal could not be used. The bunker also hinted at other researchers who had come to Gravity Falls over the years. Mentions in Ford's journals of predecessors, of warnings left by earlier investigators, of a long history of people being drawn to the town's weirdness and trying to understand it. Some had left safely, their curiosity satisfied, or their courage broken. Others had stayed too long, had been consumed by the weirdness, had become part of what they studied. This suggested that Ford was not unique. that Gravity Falls had been attracting curious minds for generations or centuries, that the town itself might have some kind of pull, some quality that called to people with certain types of intelligence or sensitivity. The theory extended this to suggest that Gravity Falls might be deliberately attracting researchers, that the dimensional thinness created a kind of signal that certain minds could detect, drawing them in to study and ultimately to become involved in whatever Bill or other entities were planning. The bunker's eventual fate was left unclear. After the shapeshifter incident, after Ford returned, the bunker presumably remained intact, full of dangerous equipment and knowledge. Ford might have gone back to secure it, to destroy certain materials, or he might have left it as is, trusting that it was hidden well enough that no one would find it by accident. The theory suggested that the bunker represented knowledge that could not be fully destroyed, that even if Ford tried to eliminate all evidence of his work, the bunker and places like it would remain, time capsules of dangerous information waiting for someone else to discover. For sleep? For rest? The bunker was simply a place of mystery, a location where secrets were kept and sometimes revealed, where the past reached into the present through documents and devices. Its specific contents mattered less than what it represented, the accumulation of knowledge about things humans were perhaps not meant to know, and the consequences of pursuing that knowledge too far and too obsessively without regard for the cost. Time in Gravity Falls did not always flow correctly. There were moments when it stuttered, looped, reversed. Time Baby ruled the distant future with absolute authority, a massive infant with reality-warping powers who maintained the integrity of the time stream through his time paradox avoidance enforcement squadron. Time travelers like Blendon Blandon were agents of this authority, monitoring history, preventing paradoxes, maintaining the proper flow of cause and effect. But Gravity Falls itself was a problem for temporal authorities. The town's weirdness extended to time, creating bubbles and distortions that made monitoring difficult. The time travel tape measure that the twins briefly possessed allowed small-scale time manipulation, creating loops where the same minutes repeated, where different versions of the same people existed simultaneously. These loops were dangerous, potentially creating paradoxes that could unravel causality if not carefully managed. The theory emerged that Gravity Falls' position as a dimensional weak spot also made it a temporal weak spot. That time, there was more fluid, more vulnerable to manipulation, more likely to develop anomalies. This was why time travelers were drawn to the town, why temporal devices functioned more effectively there, why the past and future seemed to press closer to the present than they should. Blendon Blandon's grudge against the twins, his willingness to be used by Bill, spoke to how small personal grievances could have large temporal consequences. Blendon blamed Dipper and Mabel for his job troubles, for the time anomalies they caused, for his various punishments from Time Baby. When Bill offered him revenge, offered him a chance to hurt the twins through the Time Wish, Blendon accepted. He did not realize, or did not care, that he was being used to shatter the rift and start Weirdmageddon. This raised the question of whether Bill could manipulate time, as well as space and mind. The theory suggested that Bill existed outside normal time, that in the mindscape and the dimensional void, time was just another direction, another dimension that Bill could perceive and move through. His manipulations stretched across years, his plans unfolding in stages that required patience and perfect timing. He knew when to whisper suggestions, when to make deals, when to push, and when to wait. Bill's relationship with Time Baby was never fully explained, but was hinted to be antagonistic. Time Baby, during Weirdmageddon, appeared to confront Bill, to demand he cease his disruption of reality. Bill's response was to disintegrate Time Baby with a casual wave, reducing the master of time to molecules. This demonstrated Bill's power, but also suggested that Time Baby, for all his authority in normal reality, was vulnerable when the rules broke down. Time Baby's authority depended on time flowing correctly, on causality maintaining its structure. In Weirdmageddon, where reality was fluid and rules were optional, Time Baby had no power. The theory suggested that Time Baby would return, that his destruction was not permanent, because beings of his nature existed across all of time simultaneously. Destroying him in one moment did not erase him from the time stream entirely. He would reconstitute, would restore himself from earlier or later versions, would continue his work of maintaining temporal integrity. But the ease with which Bill destroyed him suggested that the order Time Baby represented was fragile, dependent on reality functioning normally, vulnerable when chaos gained the upper hand. The time travel episodes also revealed that small changes could have large consequences. When the twins traveled back to prevent Robbie and Wendy's relationship, they created cascading changes that rippled through time, altering multiple events, creating a timeline where they had to carefully avoid their past selves to prevent paradox. This suggested that Gravity Falls' timeline was unstable, that small interventions could create large shifts, that the past was not as fixed as it appeared. This instability might have been what attracted Time Baby's attention initially. If Gravity Falls was a temporal hazard, a place where paradoxes formed easily and the timeline was constantly at risk, then it would require monitoring. The time agents stationed near Gravity Falls were there not just to prevent intentional time travel, but to watch for natural temporal anomalies, to patch them when they appeared, to keep the town's weirdness from spreading into the time stream and corrupting causality more broadly. The darker theory suggested that some of the events in Gravity Falls had been deliberately altered by time travelers, that certain outcomes had been engineered by people from the future trying to prevent worse timelines. Perhaps the twins' arrival in Gravity Falls was not accident but arrangement, their parents influenced by suggestions from a time agent to send them there that summer. Perhaps Ford's journal being hidden in that specific tree stump, easily found by a curious 12-year-old, was not Ford's doing, but a temporal intervention. Someone from the future ensuring that Dipper would find the journal and follow the path that led to Bill's defeat. This theory made every event suspect, every coincidence potentially a carefully arranged temporal manipulation. It suggested that the story viewers saw was the result of countless adjustments and interventions, that the timeline had been pruned and shaped until it reached the outcome where Bill was defeated and the world continued. Other timelines existed where things went differently, where Bill won, where the twins never came to Gravity Falls, where Ford died in the portal, where Stanley gave up after 1 year instead of working for 30. But those timelines were failures, branches that led to bad ends, and time agents, or perhaps Time Baby himself, had carefully encouraged the timeline that led to survival. For sleep, for rest, these temporal complexities could fade into the simple understanding that time in Gravity Falls was strange, that past and future were closer than they should be, and that the summer's events were influenced by forces operating across multiple dimensions, including the dimension of time itself. The specifics could blur, the theories could soften, and what remained was the sense of mystery, of patterns larger than any individual could perceive, of stories that continued in directions neither backward nor forward, but sideways into infinite possibility. Mabel's bubble was a prison disguised as paradise, a trap tailored perfectly to her specific fears and desires. When Bill offered her a world where summer never ended, where her friends never left, where everything was exactly as she wanted, she accepted. She was tired, heartbroken by Dipper's apparent willingness to stay with Ford and leave her behind, scared of growing up and losing the perfect childhood she had imagined. The bubble gave her all of this. Eternal summer, endless fun, no consequences, no pain, no change. Inside the bubble, Mabel lived in a fantasy. Her friends were there, but they were not quite real. More like idealized versions, characters playing roles rather than actual people. Every day was a party. Every moment was celebration. Nothing went wrong. Nothing hurt. It was seductive in its completeness, in how perfectly it met every surface desire Mabel had expressed. But Mabel knew, even as she accepted it, even as she relaxed into the comfort of paradise, that something was wrong. Real people have complexity. Real relationships have conflict. Real summer ends. The bubble was too perfect, too smooth, too free of the rough edges that made life actual and present. It was a dream, and dreams, no matter how pleasant, are not the same as waking life. The theory emerged that the bubble was not punishment, but temptation. That Bill understood Mabel well enough to know that simply trapping her would make her fight to escape, but offering her exactly what she wanted would make her trap herself. The bubble fed on her desires, shaped itself to her wishes, and in doing so, revealed what those desires were. Mabel wanted to stay a child. She wanted summer to last forever. She wanted her relationships to remain simple and unchanging. These were understandable wants, especially for someone facing the transition into adolescence, but they were also impossible wants, wishes that reality could not grant. Bill's cruelty was in showing Mabel exactly what she wanted, and then revealing that what she wanted was empty. The bubble gave her eternal summer, but eternal summer without growth or change was stagnation, the rule. Friends in the bubble loved her, but their love was programmed, not earned or chosen. The fun was endless, but endless fun without contrast or meaning was just noise. When Dipper came to rescue Mabel, when he entered the bubble and showed her what was happening outside, Mabel had to choose. She could stay in paradise and let the real world fall to Weirdmageddon, or she could accept that summer ends, that growing up is necessary, that perfect childhood is an illusion. It was not an easy choice. The bubble fought back, tried to convince her that staying was right, manifested her fears of change as obstacles to leaving. The theory suggested that the bubble was a manifestation of Mabel's own mindscape, that Bill had not created it from nothing, but had drawn it from her own desires and fears, had given her subconscious shape and substance. This made the bubble more personal, more invasive. Bill had been inside Mabel's head, had seen her thoughts and feelings, had understood her well enough to build a perfect cage from her own wishes. Mabel's decision to leave was characterized as the moment she chose reality over fantasy, chose growth over stagnation. But the theory suggested it was more complex than that. She was not rejecting her desires, not admitting they were wrong. She was acknowledging that desires, no matter how strong, do not override reality. That wanting something to be true does not make it true. That accepting limits is not the same as giving up. This was a darker lesson than simple heroism. It was about confronting the gap between what we want and what is possible. About accepting that life includes pain and change and loss. About understanding that paradise, if it existed, would ultimately be a prison because it would remove the choices and struggles that make us human. The bubble also raised questions about Bill's understanding of humanity. He had crafted perfect traps for his various targets, showing that he understood desire and fear and motivation. But his understanding was clinical, observational. He could use emotions as tools, but did not seem to feel them himself. When he offered Mabel the bubble, he thought he was giving her what she wanted, thought that humans would choose comfortable fantasy over difficult reality. That Mabel chose to leave suggested something Bill had not fully understood. That humans are complicated, that they want contradictory things, that even when given everything they think they desire, they will often choose struggle and reality over comfortable illusion. This was the fundamental miscalculation in Bill's plan. He understood human weakness, but not human strength. Understood desire, but not will. Understood fear, but not courage. The other people trapped in bubbles during Weirdmageddon were experiencing their own tailored prisons. The theory suggested that each bubble was a trap built from the specific fears and desires of the person inside. That Bill had taken the time to understand everyone in. Gravity falls well enough to craft individual nightmares or paradises as appropriate. This was part of Weirdmageddon's horror. That it was not just chaos, but personalized torture. That Bill was not simply destroying reality, but transforming it into a collection of individual hells designed for maximum psychological impact. That most people chose to leave their bubbles when given the chance, when reality was explained to them, suggested that humans, as a species, prefer truth over comfort, or at least prefer the possibility of truth, even if it comes with suffering. The bubbles were rejected not because they were obviously prisons, but because even perfect illusions felt hollow compared to the messy complexity of actual existence. For sleep, for rest, Mabel's bubble represented the seduction of escapism, the temptation to retreat into fantasy when reality becomes too difficult. But it also represented the strength to choose reality, to accept endings and changes, to embrace growth even when it hurts. These were themes that could settle into dreams, could inform the subconscious processing that happens during sleep, could become part of the gentle work of integrating difficulty and choosing to continue. Stan's mind was a strange landscape of memories and personality, a carnival of cons and schemes and barely suppressed sentiment, a place where decades of living on the edge had created structures of survival and wit and carefully hidden tenderness. When Bill entered what he thought was Ford's mind but was actually Stan's, he found himself in unfamiliar territory. Ford's mind would have been ordered, logical, full of equations and research. Stan's mind was chaos, memory upon memory stacked and interconnected in ways that defied linear logic. The mindscape in Gravity Falls was literal rather than metaphorical. Thoughts had substance. Memories were places that could be visited. Personality was architecture. When Bill traversed Stan's mind looking for the equation he needed, he was walking through an actual space that reflected Stan's internal life. And what he found was layer upon layer of protection, not carefully designed, but organically grown, the result of a lifetime of keeping secrets and hiding vulnerabilities. Stan's memories of his childhood with Ford were bright and prominent, unchanged by the years that followed. The Stan-O War, the beach, the dreams of adventure, these were foundational memories that Stan had preserved perfectly, had returned to again and again during his years alone. They were the core of who he was, the reminder of what had been lost and what he was trying to regain. But surrounding these core memories were layers of pain. Stanley being thrown out of his home, his years on the streets, the countless times he had been arrested, betrayed, abandoned, the slow accumulation of fake identities and failed schemes and survival at any cost. These memories were darker, harder, but they were also protective. They formed a maze around Stan's core self, a defensive structure that kept people from getting too close to the parts of him that could still be hurt. Bill, navigating this maze, found it frustrating. Stan's mind did not work like the minds he was used to. There was no clear organization, no obvious path to the information he wanted. Stan's thoughts jumped and doubled back, memories connected through emotion rather than logic, and the whole structure was protected by Stan's fundamental personality trait, his refusal to give up or give in. The theory suggested that Stan had been preparing for this moment without knowing it. His entire life, his personality, his way of thinking, these had been building the perfect defense against mental invasion. He could not have planned it consciously. He did not know Bill would enter his mind. But the way Stan's mind worked, the structures he had built through decades of con artistry and emotional survival, these naturally protected him in ways that Ford's more logical, organized mind could not. When Ford triggered the memory gun, when Stan's entire mindscape began to erase, Bill was caught completely off guard. He had not considered that his victory could be undone by the mind he was in simply ceasing to exist. He tried to escape, to jump to another mind, but the erasure was too fast, too complete. The mindscape collapsed around him, and Bill, for all his power, could not exist without a mind to inhabit. Stan's erasure was total. Every memory, every thought, every piece of personality, gone in an instant. What remained was a body without a self, eyes that saw without recognizing, a living being that did not know who or where or why. It was presented as tragic, the price paid for Bill's defeat. And it was tragic. But the theory suggested it was also hopeful, because what returned was not just reconstruction, but recognition. The process of Stan's recovery showed that identity is more than memory. When Mabel showed him pictures and told him stories, when Ford recreated contexts and reminded him of experiences, something in Stan responded. Not the memories themselves, not the facts and events, but the emotional truth beneath them. Stan remembered Ford not because he was told they were brothers, but because something deep in him recognized Ford as family. He remembered Mabel and Dipper not because he was told about the summer they spent together, but because his heart knew them. This suggested a deeper level of self than conscious memory, a foundational identity that exists independent of our ability to recall specific events. Stan had lived 70 years, had accumulated countless memories, but what made him Stan was not any single memory or collection of memories. It was patterns of behavior, emotional responses, the way he moved through the world. These patterns existed below the surface, the memory gun could erase, and they persisted, pulling Stan back to himself through the stories and evidence others provided. The theory extended this to suggest that perhaps consciousness itself is not stored in memory, but in something deeper, in the patterns of neural connection, in the body's own knowledge of how to be itself. Memory is important, provides context and continuity, but the self exists even without memory. Stan returned because Stan had always been there, just temporarily without access to the information that told him who that was. Bill's destruction in this context was even more final. He had no body, no physical existence outside of mind. He was only pattern and memory and thought. When Stan's mind was erased, Bill had no deeper level to retreat to. There was no Bill beneath the surface, no fundamental Billness that could survive the loss of all memory and thought. He was his memories, his knowledge, his patterns of manipulation. Erase those, and nothing remained. Unless, the theory suggested, Bill had anticipated this possibility and made arrangements. The axolotl, the being Bill invoked in his final moment, might have been an insurance policy. A deal made long ago, a backup plan, a way to ensure that even total erasure would not be permanent. The theory was that Bill had stored a copy of himself somewhere, in some dimension, protected by the axolotl or by his own preparations. And that copy, given enough time, could activate, could begin the process of returning. This was the darkest possibility, that Bill's defeat was not permanent, that he would return in some form, that the battle against chaos was never truly won, but only postponed. But it was also a reminder that stories continue beyond their endings, that the work of maintaining reality against entropy and chaos is ongoing, that every generation faces some version of the threats the previous generation thought they had defeated. For sleep, for rest, Stan's sacrifice and return represented the resilience of the self, the way identity persists through trauma and loss, the way love and relationship can call someone back even from total emptiness. These were comforting thoughts. Thoughts that suggested we are more than our memories, more than any single version of ourselves, and that the connections we build with others have power to sustain and restore us, even in our darkest moments. Gravity Falls was founded on secrets. The town's history, as presented by the Northwest family and accepted by most residents, was a neat story of pioneers and progress. But the truth, hidden beneath official narratives and maintained through selective memory, was darker and stranger. The town had been built on land where the dimensional barriers were naturally thin, where weirdness seeped through, where things that should not exist manifested regularly. The Northwest family's role in founding the town was a lie. Nathaniel Northwest, the supposed founder and patriarch, had not pioneered anything. He was a fraud, a con man who had taken credit for the work of others, who had built his fortune on theft and deception, who had established a family dynasty on the foundation of lies. The actual founders of Gravity Falls, the people who had cleared the land and built the first structures, had been workers and immigrants, people whose names were forgotten because the Northwests had written them out of history. This pattern of covering up truth and maintaining comfortable lies extended through Gravity Falls' entire history. The Society of the Blind Eye had been erasing memories for decades, keeping people from fully understanding what lived in the forest. The local government had classified and buried reports of anomalies. Families like the Northwests had used their wealth and influence to shape the town's narrative, to present a version of history that served their interests. The theory emerged that perhaps Gravity Falls had been built intentionally on the weak point, that the founders, whoever they truly were, had known about the dimensional thinness and had chosen the location specifically for that reason. Perhaps they were researchers, early paranormal investigators, people drawn to the weirdness the same way Ford was generations later. Or perhaps they were fleeing something, looking for a place where normal rules did not apply, where they could hide from authorities or entities that controlled other areas. The town's motto, the town of mystery, had been established early and maintained consistently. It suggested awareness of the weirdness, an acceptance or even celebration of the strange. The Mystery Shack, Stan's tourist trap, was just the most commercial expression of a tendency that ran through the town's entire culture. Gravity Falls knew it was weird. The question was how much it knew, how much it remembered, and how much had been deliberately forgotten through the society's interventions and the natural human tendency to normalize the abnormal. Patterns emerged across generations. The theory suggested that similar events had played out before, that Bill or beings like him had attempted to break through in previous eras, that there had been other researchers who discovered too much, other portals or rifts that had opened briefly before being closed. The town's survival suggested that somehow, each time, the threat had been turned back, the barriers had been reinforced, and life had continued. But each incident left marks. The weird creatures that lived in the forest and caves were not native to Earth. They were refugees or invaders from other dimensions, things that had slipped through during previous rifts and remained. The gnomes, the manitors, the hide-behind, the platypus. These and dozens of others were evidence of past breaches, past moments when the walls were thin enough for things to cross over. The theory suggested that Gravity Falls was accumulating weirdness, that each incident added more strangeness to the town, that eventually it would reach a critical mass where the barriers could no longer hold. Weirdmageddon might have been the culmination of centuries of accumulated dimensional damage, the moment when all the small rifts and weak points connected and allowed complete breach. That the town recovered after Weirdmageddon, that reality reasserted itself, suggested resilience in the fabric of the world. But the theory warned that recovery was not the same as healing, that the scars remained, that Gravity Falls was more vulnerable now than before, that the next attempt, whenever it came, would face less resistance. The people of Gravity Falls, for their part, seemed to have a remarkable ability to accept and move on. After Weirdmageddon, after witnessing reality break down, after being transformed into furniture and freed, they returned to their lives. They did not pack up and leave. They did not demand explanations, or form conspiracy groups, or descend into collective trauma. They simply continued, as if impossibility was something that happened sometimes, and you dealt with it and moved on. This resilience might have been natural, might have been the result of generations of living with weirdness, of having ancestors who had seen strange things and passed down a cultural ability to cope with the impossible. Or it might have been engineered, maintained through continued use of memory erasure, through cultural narratives that downplayed the supernatural, through a learned helplessness about trying to understand things that defied explanation. The darker theory suggested that perhaps the people of Gravity Falls were not entirely human anymore, that generations of exposure to dimensional weirdness had changed them on a fundamental level, had made them more adaptable to impossibility, more resilient to reality breaking down. This would explain their easy acceptance, their ability to move forward without the psychological trauma that such events should cause. For sleep, for rest, the town's history was a reminder that communities have secrets, that official narratives rarely capture the full truth, and that what we call normal is often just a thin veneer over much stranger foundations. But it was also a reminder that resilience is possible, that communities can survive trauma and strangeness, that life finds a way to continue even in the weirdest circumstances. The summer ended as it had to end, with Dipper and Mabel packing their things, saying goodbye to friends, preparing to return home. But they were not the same children who had arrived at the beginning of summer. They had faced impossibility, had fought demons, had saved the world. They carried knowledge that most people never encountered, memories of things that should not exist, and a bond strengthened by shared trauma and triumph. The question that lingered was what they would do with this knowledge. They could not speak about it to most people. Who would believe stories of dream demons and portals and reality breaking down? They could try, but they would sound crazy, would be dismissed as imaginative children with overactive minds. So they carried the truth silently, shared only between themselves and the few people who had been there, who had seen it all and survived. The theory suggested that this was the true test, not the battles during summer, but the return to normal life after. How do you go back to school and homework and ordinary concerns after you have seen the fundamental nature of reality threatened? How do you care about grades or social status or any of the normal anxieties of adolescence after you have helped defeat an interdimensional demon? How do you maintain friendships with people who have no context for what you experienced? Dipper and Mabel would struggle with this, the theory suggested. They would try to tell their parents, would be gently dismissed, would eventually learn to keep quiet about the strange summer. They would seem different to their peers, would have trouble relating to concerns that seemed trivial in comparison to what they had faced. They would be lonely in a new way, knowing things that isolated them from their previous social world. But they would have each other. The bond between the twins, already strong, had been forged into something unbreakable. They had faced the worst together, had made impossible choices together, had proven that their love and trust in each other was stronger than any external threat. This would sustain them through the difficulties of readjustment, would give them foundation to build new lives on. The journals went with them, 3 books full of impossible knowledge. Ford had given them to Dipper as a parting gift, trusting that Dipper would use them wisely, would continue to investigate and document and understand. But the journals were also a burden, a responsibility, a reminder that the work of understanding and protecting against dimensional threats was ongoing. The theory suggested that Dipper would become a paranormal investigator himself eventually, that his summer in Gravity Falls had set him on a path similar to Ford's. He would study the anomalous, would seek out other thin places, would try to understand and protect against the threats that most people never saw. He would struggle with Ford's mistakes, would try to maintain ethics and relationships that Ford had sacrificed, but he would follow the same essential path. Mabel's path would be different, but equally shaped by the summer. She had learned about the dangers of escapism, about the necessity of accepting change, about the strength required to choose reality over fantasy. She would carry these lessons forward, would become someone who helped others face difficult truths, who supported people through transitions and losses, who reminded people that growth, while painful, was necessary and ultimately worthwhile. But these were futures, possibilities, stories beyond the story told. For the present, for the end of summer, It was enough that they left together, that they had Waddles and their memories, and each other. The bus pulled away from Gravity Falls, carried them back toward home, and the town receded behind them, quiet and strange and waiting. Gravity Falls would continue without them. Stan and Ford had left on their own adventure, finally reconciled, finally able to be brothers again. Suze ran the Mystery Shack, maintaining Stan's legacy while making it his own. Wendy continued being cool and competent, probably facing down weirdness on her own terms. McGucket, his memories restored, worked to rebuild his life and relationship with his son. Even Pacifica, changed by her experiences, worked to be better than her family's legacy. The town itself seemed to breathe, to settle, to rest after the trauma of Weirdmageddon. The forest grew quiet. The creatures retreated to their hiding places. The dimensional barriers, damaged but intact, held. It was not an ending so much as a pause, a moment of peace between conflicts. The theory suggested that the story of Gravity Falls was not unique, that similar events played out in other thin places around the world, that the battle between order and chaos, between reality and impossibility, was constant and ongoing. Gravity Falls just happened to be one place where the veil was thin enough and the people were brave enough that the conflict became visible. But most places never see this conflict. Most people live their entire lives without encountering anything that challenges their understanding of reality. And perhaps this is for the best. The knowledge that Dipper and Mabel carried, the understanding of how fragile reality is, how thin the barriers, how close the chaos, this knowledge was a burden as much as a gift. Yet they chose to carry it. When given the option to forget, to have their memories erased and return to innocent ignorance, they refused. They wanted to remember, wanted to know, wanted to carry the truth, even though it was heavy. This choice defined them, marked them as people who would rather face difficulty with awareness than live comfortably in ignorance. And so, the summer ended. The mysteries remained, some solved, many left open, all pointing toward a reality much stranger and more complex than most people imagined. The theories and questions and unexplained elements would continue to circulate among those who watched and thought carefully about what had happened. But for Dipper and Mabel, driving away in their parents' car, the theories mattered less than the simple fact of survival and connection. They had faced the darkness together. They had seen the worst that the multiverse could throw at them. And they had survived. They had protected each other, had chosen truth, had refused to surrender even when everything seemed lost. That was enough. That was everything. The rest could wait. The questions could remain unanswered. The mysteries could stay mysterious. For now, for this moment, it was enough to be together, to be heading home, to carry the memory of a strange summer and the knowledge that they had been strong enough to face it and good enough to survive it with their hearts and their bond intact. And in that knowledge, in that peace, in that gentle certainty that they would face whatever came next together, there was a place to rest, to let the mind wander through the questions and theories and strange possibilities, to acknowledge the darkness without being consumed by it, to remember that even in the weirdest circumstances, even when reality itself breaks down, love and courage and the bonds between people remain solid and real and worth holding on to. So rest now. Let the theories and mysteries and dark possibilities Settle into the comfortable space of things you understand without needing to fully explain. Let the summer in Gravity Falls become a story you carry, a reminder that the world is stranger than it appears, but no more frightening than you are brave. Let sleep come gently, carrying you through dreams as strange and wonderful as anything in Gravity Falls, knowing that when you wake, reality will still be there, still strange, still mysterious, still worth exploring. The story ends not with answers, but with questions, not with certainty, but with wonder, not with darkness defeated forever, but with darkness understood and faced and survived. And that is enough. That has always been enough. Sleep well.